Some boats push, some boats tow. Some are made up alongside, some are even made up pushing a barge backwards. In this video we're going to try to explain why. You're going to have to deal with my very poorly made visual aids, but hopefully I can explain it. And stick around to the end because I have a couple videos that a friend of mine made showing a boat getting on the wire and rounding up on a barge that if you're into this sort of thing you'll probably like that too. So come on, let's get going. This is going to be our barge and our wonderful tugboat. So in the first example we want to call this pushing in the notch, where this would be the stern of the barge. This would be the bow of the barge, and obviously the bow of the tug. The tug comes in here, and this is called pushing. We push ahead for a couple reasons. One is, it's when we get made up here, we put a couple lines up. We actually use something called a spectral line, which is kind of like it's made out of a synthetic material that's like Kevlar. Line that's this big actually has the breaking strength of a wire line that's like this big. It's pretty amazing. Amazing stuff. It's very prone to chafe, but anyway, we put it from here to here and from here to here. We lock in the bow and put up some safeties just in case there's a problem. And what happens is it basically makes the two units one. So we like that in calm weather because now instead of just steering the boat, the boat steers like a big boat now. So we also can control it when we're pushing to the water. If we want to stop, you know, we don't have brakes on a boat, but you can put it in reverse and take the way off. So when you're made up as one like that, you can do that. You can also do something called walking, where when the barge isn't too loaded or something like that, you can move it sideways, and I'll get into that in another video. But that's one of the reasons why we like towing, or we like pushing from behind. You're made up just like a big boat, and it works really well. We can't always do that when the weather's rough. But it's not just rough, it's when it's windy. If it's really windy, like it has been for the last few days over here in New York, the longer this area is here from the boat to the end of the barge, the longer your lever is. You know, if you have a lever like this and you push on this, you don't need to push too much to make things move. Where if you pushed like this, you'd have to push quite a bit more. You'd shorten the distance of the lever. So if our tugboat's 100 feet long and our barge is 300 or 400 feet long, adding it together makes it a bigger lever. So when the wind's acting on the barge, generally we talk about the wind being an effect on a light barge, where the tide, what we call the tide, is really the current. It's just what we say in our vernacular is the tide. We're not talking about the tide going up and down vertically, we're talking about the current horizontally. So when the barge is light, it's a much bigger sail, but the effect on the barge from the current is not as great because most of it's out of the water. And in that case, the barge would be up, but the tug is going to remain in the water, and the effect of the current will be more on the tug than it will be on the barge. So if the wind is blowing and we're coming into a dock over here, we don't want to go crashing in like this to the dock. So, you know, if the wind's blowing like that, you won't be able to hold the barge. The barge won't go straight. You'll be driving straight, but you'll be falling down the whole time like that. So we have to do something else. Another time that we have to do something else is if we're pushing and it's rough. Now, depending on your setup, there are other tugboats called ATBs, or articulating tugging barges, that instead of using lines back here for push gear, they actually have pins up here in the notch, and they get pinned. When I say pins, they're like 3 feet around. They're huge. They're massive things. But they articulate, and so Well, let me get to that in a second. The reason why we can't push in bad weather is that the mass of the barge, you know, when it's loaded or even if it's not loaded because it's a big steel structure, moves at a different rate than the mass of the tug. So as waves come through, this thing wants to move this way or up and down like this, and that puts tremendous stresses on these wires. We call them wires, but they're, you know, back in the day they used to be wires, but now that they synthetic lines. And so you can break off these ends, you can break off the tow gear, the push gear itself, you can do damage to your winch, you can do all kinds of stuff. So when there's any kind of sea out there, we can't really do much. Another thing is if the barge is rolling, like if there's a side sea coming in like this, we can't, you know, they won't roll together. The barge will probably roll at a different rate than the tug will. And so as it does that, one line's going to get tight, the other line will get loose, and it puts a lot of shock load on the two, and that's where you run into trouble. So then if you have an ATB, those are the ones without the wires here, you have the pins up in front. Instead of locking the whole thing together, there are pins that make it, it's called an ATB because it articulates. And articulate means that it moves back and forth like this. I'm doing this so that the camera can see it, but it would really look like this. I don't know if you like my little explanation here. But so in other words, if a sea's coming this way, and the barge is staying relatively stable. The barge isn't stable, it just seems stable from the tug's point of view because it doesn't move as much as the tug does. So the tug would roll back and forth like that on those pins. Now if it moves back and forth this way, those pins are so big they can take up the strain of the tug moving back and forth. But coming this way and this way, it's able to freely articulate in there with the two pins in there, and that's how an ATB works. But for us, when if the wind's blowing and we don't want to have that long lever, or if there's a lot of you know, if there's a sea and we can't be in push gear, another option for us is coming alongside. And there's two ways we can do that. We can tow on the hip like this, and we call this heads and heads. So the bow is the head of the tug, and the bow of the barge is there, and it's heads and heads. And it depends where you are in the country. When we had a contract where we were running up and down the Mississippi, and it's quite normal for us with our 50 barges, because of the way they are, they're very light in the bow and very heavy in the stern, that we push them what we call heads and tails, like this. They have these things called skegs, which are kind of rudders in the back, and those skegs dig in the water and it keeps everything moving straight. Where when we're like this, once that bow is so light and there's so much weight back here, once the bow takes off, you can't really stop it and it's hard to control it. So it's very common for us to push it backwards. I guess it's not that common in places in other parts of the country. When I'd be going up and down the Mississippi River, there were plenty of people saying, hey, you know, you're pushing that barge backwards. But anyway, when we do this, whether we do it heads and tails or heads and heads, there's a couple things that we do. First of all, we do it with 3 lines. We use something called a tow strap, which is just a doubled up, really heavy duty line, and it's a soft line that can stretch. We don't want one of those synthetic lines. Those synthetic lines have no stretch at all. We want something that will take up, so if there is a, you know, if in New York we have a lot of ferry wakes of the high-speed ferries that go by and the Staten Island ferries that go by, when wakes go by, and they might be 3 feet or something like that, we want this to move up and down without breaking the lines. So the stretch in the line helps us a little bit. When I say stretch in the line, it's a big, heavy line. You wouldn't think you could stretch it, but you're putting massive amounts of loads on there, and it allows itself to stretch a little bit. But what we'll do is we'll put one, you know, a doubled up line going this way, and then we'll put a bow line going this way, and then we call this pinch. This is how much the stern comes in and out. We don't usually want to go perfectly flat, because if we went through the water, this being a resistant load over here would always want to go that way. So we'd have to carry right rudder and have to crab through the water like that. But if we add a little bit of pinch like that, you'll see sometimes you'll say, oh, look at that, it looks sideways. That's done on purpose. So now we have a line going this way, the bow line's tight here, and a stern line going across here. Now when the tugboat drives through the water, this catches a little bit of water that pulls it this way. The overhanging catches it, pulls it that way, and if you get it just right, you'll have 0 degrees of rudder and you'll go through the water like that. Something that's also kind of interesting that a lot of newer people on deck don't really understand. They're like, why do we do that? You'll see this line right here will go, usually will go backwards because we're towing it. This line carries the load of pulling the barge ahead. This line usually goes forward, and this line is for two things. One is if anything goes wrong, you need to stop. When you back, that forward line going this way will pull back on the barge and pull the weight off of the barge. It will also, if we make a turn to starboard like this, the stern's going to want to go in this way, but it can't go in because you're up against over here. So that line right there carries the load of pulling it and rotating it around. This line on the stern, a lot of people would think would have to go aft. And sometimes you'll see, sometimes barges will, tugs will even have the stern sticking out farther than the end of the barge. And you'll see the stern line just goes straight across. And you're like, well, what is that going to do? That's not going to do anything. Because you normally have opposing lines is what, you know, like when you tie something up. And the reason why we do that is that if you have a pinch and you're like this, and the line's going this way, and this line's going this way, this line pulls you ahead, this line stops you, and turns, helps you turn to the right, and if you turn to the left, it doesn't really matter, you're going to be pushing in that way, but what's going to happen is your stern's going to lift out. So that line going straight across there doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if it goes straight across, a little bit forward, a little bit aft. All that's doing is keeping your stern from falling out when you make a turn into the barge. So as you wanted to turn this way, and you started going this way, you go like that, but that line would come tight and hold you in there, and then you rotate that way. And the same thing happens if you tie up this way too. There are times that you'll see tugs that are more towards the center of the barge, and that happens sometimes when it's very windy out. You can hold onto a barge and have less of a lever. That works sometimes better that way. There are also some people that have to stay at anchor with a barge, and they'll tie up in the middle. You know, they don't want to be in the notch, but they'll be in the middle like that. But generally speaking, you're usually about here or about here, something like that, depending on the barge. And this isn't to scale. This is just a piece of paper that I cut out in 2 minutes. You can see I never really did well in arts and crafts class. All right, so that's why we do this. And then of course there's the other reasons why we push, or we go alongside. You know, we go heads and heads, or heads and tails alongside. Another reason, and this is probably the most common reason why we make the difference between the two, is it depends where we're going. If we're going alongside a ship, it really doesn't matter if we go this way, because we can come alongside the ship like this, or we can turn around and come alongside the ship like that. So it doesn't really matter. However, maybe you have a barge that only discharges on one side. Say the tankerman says, hey, we have to do a port side discharge. So in that case, you want to make up on this side so that you can get over there and do whatever you have to do if you have to be on the side. You know, and if you're like this, you can still do that. But there are other times that we go into a slip. And what we mean by a slip is when imagine this is the side of the land, and there's a dock like this and a dock like this, and we have to get in here like that. Sometimes we can drive straight in. Other times we say, well, when it's loaded, if we take it in light, it has to come out loaded. So we don't want to back out a loaded barge. Sometimes it's better to drive one into the slip this way, heads and tails, then they load it here at the slip, and then when you come and get it, I think that in one of my videos you'll see, I think in the day in the life video, you'll see I went and I got the barge, I slid it up like that, and I came around and back and got it. Then when it got a loaded barge, because obviously a loaded barge isn't going to move, it's not going to handle nearly as well as a light barge does, provided the wind isn't blowing, and then you can just drive away. But there's also other situations where maybe you're coming to a slip. We'll pretend that this my mouse pad here is a slip, and this is, we need to get in here. And if the wind or the tide is going this way, it doesn't really matter. We can come in like this, we can come in like this, we can even back it in like that if we want to be really creative. That's fine. But if the wind or the tide is going away and you're going to fall away from there, without an assist tug, you're going to come in, and you'll come in, maybe the wind's coming that way, you'll drive up like that, you'll try to get a line, maybe they will get a line, maybe they won't, and the whole time you're here, you're going to be falling off. And remember, we don't have bow thrusters or anything like that. And people say, well, you can walk it one way or you can walk it another way. You can walk a little bit. I like to refer to it more as leaning than anything else. And if you don't know what walking is, I like to say there's been some requests for me to do some stuff on boat handling, which I'll try to do in some other video in another time. But, so the wind or the tide is pulling you off the dock. Well, in that situation, you're going to know that before you get to the dock, because you're going to look at the charts, you're going to look at your tide tables, you're going to figure out which way the wind's blowing, and you know before you leave where you're going. And so if you say to yourself, okay, I would like to make up like this because it drives better this way, but when I get there I have to be stern in the slip so they can pull out later, but so I can't put it in backwards, there's no room here to get anywhere. So if I make up heads and heads alongside, the wind or the tide is coming this way, being alongside, first of all, the tide is going to have an effect. It's going to have less of an effect where the slip is and more of an effect in the channel, because it's going to be free water here. And your tug is going to be usually the deepest part for us anyway, unless you're doing a really heavy, great big 50 barge, but most of our bunker barges don't draw as much as the tug does. So the tug is going to be a big underwater foil to catch all that tide. It's just going to pull you off and that sort of stuff. So if you can get alongside like this, and the tide or the wind is coming this way, you can drive up like this, spin it in like this, and the whole time you're doing this, you're reducing how much is getting caught in the tide here. Now you're not sticking out all the way over here, and you can try to push it in there. And sometimes you have a lot more lateral control when you're made up alongside than you do when you're over here. I don't know if I said this before, but another advantage of being in push gear like this is that you're pushing one body of water through through the water, so you can usually make better time and better speed when you're like this. When you're doing this, you have the body of the barge and the body of the tug, and especially if you have a pinch, then now you're even pushing it more, so you don't make as good time. But anyway, that's going back to another subject. So that's why sometimes you have to figure out which way you're going to do it depending on where you're going. Okay, so then the next thing is sometimes you might see some people that are, like sailboats that are offshore or power boats or whatever, and you say, why is that tug they're not pushing, there's a big line in between them and they're towing. Now you're going like this. And we tow, that's something that you normally do when you have a lot of room. You can make the best speed towing, because where you were towing like this before, I shouldn't say you make the best speed, I'm just saying that when you put the wire in between you, you could start going through a lot of seas. So if the weather were to get rough, or the tide changed, things started to get nasty, and as this started to react less than this did, the difference between the two usually is one of the factors that determines how much wire there is. Sometimes you might say, look, they tow very close. Other times you might say, oh my God, that barge is like you know, 1,200 feet behind the tug, sometimes even more. And that's usually depending on how much weather there is. And it doesn't have to be blowing, it can be how much swell there is too. What happens is the wire that goes from here to there, not only is it big, it's also very heavy. And that's designed on purpose. It's not just because it has to be something that's strong. They do that, the wire, that as it comes off the back of the tug, because it's heavy, it'll fall down and make a dip before it comes back up here. They call that a catenary. And if the weather is calm, you don't need much of a catenary at all. In fact, there's been times where you can tow it exactly straight and even right out of the water. You can tow it just like that and everything's fine. But if it is rough, you need to add more catenary, and so you start putting that wire in the water, and hopefully you're doing it in a place where it's deep, so that the wire doesn't touch the bottom, because that's something that you don't want to do. But the more wire you put out, you're effectively putting more and more of a shock absorber in to relieve the loads. If you imagine a swell coming like this, and the two are going together, in a perfect world, I think in the books they call it, you want to get the two in step. And I've talked to a lot of other guys that we all say, you know what, in step is really good, but it's very hard to do, and we don't even know if it ever can be done unless your barge has the same hydrodynamics or the barge has the same hydrodynamics as the tug. So it's very hard to do. So what happens is, constantly, as this is going up a wave, it's going to slow down. And as it goes down the wave, it wants to surf down the wave. The same thing will happen with the barge. Now, it won't go up and down like this as much as the tugboat will. The tugboat will be much more violent. But what will happen is, as the waves come and hit the bow of the barge, it slows down, and as it stops, as it goes by, it speeds up. So when we're saying speeds up and slows down, these are things you and I don't feel, but it's what's actually happening in, between the wire is something that has to pick that up. So if you had a short wire, that wire would go bang, really tight, and then really loose, and then really tight, and then really loose, and you blow everything. You probably rip the winch right off the deck, or break the bridle, or break the shackle, or break the socket. Awful things would happen. So long before that happens, you start paying out more and more wire. And the wire, it's possible to put 2 or 3 tons worth of wire out in between the two of you. And the tonnage of the wire, actually, if we slow down, it's going to go. If we slowed down, these two would come together and the wire would hit the bottom. So if you went to go slow down, you have to start lifting the wire up if it's in a shallow area. But that wire is actually going up and down in the water as the waves are coming like this between the tug and the barge. I don't know if I'm making that clear. I don't know if remember, I'm just a tugboat guy. I'm trying to explain this, and don't know if I'm doing a good job. Hopefully you guys can tell me in the comments if it's making sense or not. But imagine that the tug, if the wave is coming like this, the tug is going to slow down. As it slows down, this is going to start coming towards it. This distance is going to shorten up, and the wire is going to start to settle down. Then the tug rises up, then the tug starts to fall down. Now, there might be 2 or 3 sets, maybe 10 sets of waves before it gets over here, but the same thing's going to happen over here. As this is speeding down the wave, this might be coming up onto the wave and slowing down. So this is speeding up while this is slowing down, and the two go like that. And if you didn't have enough wire out, it would come up really tight, and the shock load would be intense, and it would be terrible. So that's why they tow. So basically, those are the types. Remember, we have pushing from in the notch, made up on the hip or alongside, heads and heads, made up on the hip or alongside, heads and tails, or towing on the wire. Hopefully that explains everything. Woo! That video got really long, really fast. So I promised that I was gonna put some videos at the end of this. This video is way too long, so what I'm gonna do is, for all of you subscribers out there, I'm going to put an unlisted video and give you, all the subscribers, a URL to that link, so you can click in and see Captain Ed Scott getting on the wire and Captain Ed Scott getting off the wire. He does a fantastic job, and the video is kind of fun. It's a little time lapse. You'll love it. Anyway, thanks again, and really appreciate you guys helping out my channel. If you haven't liked and subscribed, please do. It helps me out, helps the channel. It's fast, free, and really helps me out. I guess I already said that once, huh? But and if you subscribe, you'll get the URL to the 2 little videos I'm going to put up. Alright, thank you. Take care. See you next Tuesday. Try to upload something every Tuesday if I can.